One, do you think that, and these are honest questions, do you think that, I guess, how much of these challenges do you think were, are the contributing factors people leaving for places like the URC, like you mentioned, and how much of this is just sort of the institutional atrophy of, being four, five, six generations removed from kind of where this all started? Some of
Yeah.
both. I mean,
It, so the issue was and still is how to present a and this is to some extent the issue that we're fighting right now. What will be the identity of the post-ethnic CRC?
right.
Um, and right now, the identity of that church, I mean, the people that have the political power in the denomination are saying it will be a kind of Calvinism, which is pretty different from the Calvinism that I grew up with. It's not Kuyperian; it's more young, restless, and reformed kind of Calvinism. That will be the official stance, and so this will be a church that is against same-sex marriage, that is comes down heavily in favor of penal substitutionary atonement. There's a kind of portrait of the theology and of God actually in that, which I find off-putting, but that's where the denomination is moving. There was a time back in 80s, 90s, teens maybe, that the denomination could have defined itself differently theologically. That kind of theological work never happened.
Hmm.
The CRC does not do theology. They did at one time, maybe. You go to classes, Central California, and you listen to examinations of candidates, and they examine all kinds of people there. The right answers are the answers given by Louis Berkhoff in systematic theology, though. That's mid 20th century, and then it was kind of old in theology. And if you dare think differently than that, you're going to have some problems in your examination.
So instead of doing theology, we're kind of stuck. Is that what I hear you saying?
Yeah,
Yeah.
so part of that story is, and let me just propose something here, which is that I want to use the Mueller categories. So I grew up in a church that was sincerity culture. That was when I was a kid, and so you were Christian Reformed because you were born Christian Reformed. And very few people actually became Christian Reformed in any other way. There weren't very many proselytes. But and it had roles. You went to church twice on Sunday. You sent your kids to Christian school. If you didn't send your kid to a Christian school, you're going to get a visit from the elders. You didn't go to movies. Your grandparents went to the movies when they were young, and they got a visit from the elders.
Mhm.
And they long remembered that. So my parents, I'll give you an even worse illustration. My parents were poor, and they were not able to entirely keep up their church payments. So what you did is you took the budget and you just divided it into however many families you had, and each family paid the same amount. And that amount was assigned you. So they were not able to keep it up. They got a visit. Why aren't you keeping up your payments to the church? They didn't have the money to do it. Then in the time that I was in high school, and probably just a little bit before that, so this had been the 60s, early 60s, you started to get the encroachment of evangelical theology, and Billy Graham was the was the first inkling of that. You know, Billy Graham would do his crusades, and he was doing one in Seattle, I remember. And the question is, do CRC churches send people? Do they volunteer? Do they support this? Or is that Arminian theology? And, you know, so it was partly an identity question. And what came up out of that was that your Christianity has to be not just going to church on Sunday, but it has to be authentic. So now we're moving from a sincerity culture into an authentic culture. And that happened not from the left, that happened from the right. You need to, in Linden, I remember people saying to me, and I didn't know how to react to this, you know, Clay, you're not really a Christian. You go to church, but, you know, have you taken Jesus into your heart? You know, that kind of thing. Adria remembers going to Vacation Bible School. And this is a great illustrative story. So she was going to Vacation Bible School.
That's your wife?
Yeah, my wife. Yes.
Okay.
My aunt.
Yeah, yeah, right. She was going to Vacation Bible School out in the country where they lived. You know where they lived.
Yep.
And there was a Baptist church, and they said to Adria, you know, have you taken Jesus into your heart? So she went forward at the Vacation Bible School, and she came home and she told her mother, you know, I took Jesus into my heart today, and her mother looked at her and kind of glared at her and said, you already did that, you know. So something was shifting,
Yep.
right? It was going from the idea of a sincerity culture in which you play a role, and, you know, are you sincere in your role? Do you do your role well? That's really the question. And whether you do your role well or not is the judgment of the community, not your judgment entirely.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So, are you a good father? Are you a good mother? Are you a good Christian? Are you a good church person? All of those kinds of things. That got in places like Linden, Washington, got blown up by the whole evangelical question. Do you really have? Are you going to be saved because you don't have Jesus in your heart? You just go to church. You know, you're not really a Christian. And so there was a friend of mine who went off and had a experience in some kind of a evangelical setting, and he came back and told me I was not a Christian at all. So for me, the spiritual issue in my life for a long time was, do I have an authentic experience of God and Jesus?
Well, and even just to elaborate on that, even in the context of Linden, when Clay, you and I have talked a little bit about this, you know, my dad co-owned a hardware store, and the obvious thing to do 50 or 100 years ago was you take over the hardware store, you take over the farm, you kind of have this role. I mean, just beyond the church as an institution, just in the way that everyone related to any kind of institution, it was so predefined. And there was no notion of trying to discover yourself through your role in an institution, because it was laid out for you plainly. And the CRC as an immigrant church slotted very well into that, at least in the community that I was from.
And your parents would be perfect illustrations of where this next step goes, which is that once you start to open up the question of, you know, is your experience an authentic experience, all that sort of thing, suddenly it changes. It just shifted everything in ways that people did not entirely understand, but it made a huge difference. And so when CRC people got upset about things going on in the CRC, whether it was women in office or just something local happening, and there are, you know, every church goes through seasons of difficulty. They leave and they don't go to the CRC. They go to a place where they have the kind of experience they're looking for, where they can at first sit in the back pews and just, or chairs, they're never pews. And so the largest church in Linden now, by far, is Christ the King.
North County Christ the King.
Right, North County Christ the King. Yeah, it's
Yep.
and it is it meets in a former grocery store, and it's filled with people that had been CRC, and all there are 5 congregations in Linden itself, and all of them are diminished to some extent. We could come back to that, but that's so. But now something new is happening, and I think that the Mueller thing gets at that pretty well, and that's this idea of what he calls so he has sincerity, authenticity. I mean, I went through the sincerity, authenticity kind of shift, and I had to figure out how to deal with that. Now it's the huge shift from authenticity culture to what they call prophilicity culture, in which, once again, the community matters, only now it's the virtual community. It's it's a very different kind of sense of community, but, and you no longer are worried about authentic experience. You're worried about the presentation of who you are. You're curating your image, your presentation on social media, but on a lot of other places. And you may have several different identities, and there's no great reason why you shouldn't. You can be one thing in one place and another thing in another place, and that's fine. That's just meeting the context. And the right wing in the CRC has seized that move, and the left wing can't figure it out at all.
Can you elaborate on that?
So
I'm about 60% sure of this distinction here.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So you think about well, I mean, I can give you a whole lot of examples of this in terms of, I probably could give you some left-wing examples too, but these are just ones that come to my mind. One of the people that was hugely influential in Linden, and probably in a lot of other places, was Rush Limbaugh. Because the dairy farmers all had radios in their milking parlors, and the radio was always for hours every morning would broadcast Rush Limbaugh, right?
I listened to Rush Limbaugh 3 hours every day when I picked raspberries.
Yeah,
in the 90s.
Right. So
that's what we did.
He was clever, funny, and almost everything that the right-wing political is now started with Rush, right, in many ways. Rush Limbaugh didn't start as a conservative. That became a kind of, he started, I think he actually had a phase when he was kind of a garden variety liberal, but that's not where the money was. I mean, that's probably attributing motives, but he moved into a profile which is become self-reinforcing, in which he was this kind of funny, sarcastic guy who owned the libs, and created all this stuff. That's what Mueller's talking about in this book. He's talking about the fact that you adopt an identity, and you may believe it deeply or you may not believe it deeply. It doesn't matter. Once you develop this kind of profile, it's self-reinforcing. You get clicks for that, and then that leads you to more clicks and so forth. That's kind of the thing that's going on. So there's a sense in which the people who came out of actually the Young, Restless, and Reformed people, Kevin DeYoung, he was my neighbor for a while, have that kind of profile. You look at them and there's that kind of profile idea, right? I mean, they've adopted a way to be public, a kind of profile. And when I look at the CRC, right, I see some of that happening. But there's an interesting connection here. So if you think about it in terms of 3 things, the sincerity culture, this is way too simple, but the sincerity culture, the authenticity culture, and the prophilicity culture, the sincerity culture and the prolificity culture have some things in common, like this idea of community, that, it's community reinforcing. So that people who are still kind of in that sincerity culture hear in the people in the prolificity culture the things that they want to hear, even though the prolificity culture is just ideologically totally different. And the people that are getting sandwiched in between are the people in the authenticity culture. I mean, there's all these books now, have been for a while, the kind of channeling Charles Taylor that, and these books are
like that one right here.
Okay, all right. Yeah. So these books are all saying, oh, we moved from, they don't use the sincerity, authenticity, but we moved from this way of being, from identity being assigned to us to this new kind of fraught authenticity culture. And what a terrible thing that modernity has already moved beyond that. The people that are in the authenticity culture are kind of caught in a time warp. As usual, we're talking, criticizing people who, already themselves trying to figure out how to navigate this next thing. So that's the way I read that. I think that the CRC right is a very different animal than was the old CRC sincerity culture that I grew up in.
The conservatives of the 80s and so on.
Right.
Or 70s and 60s.
The classic example of this would be the guy you mentioned. I won't mention his name, but who is the elder who comes from Iowa every year to Synod dressed in overalls.
Yep.
Herb's watching. Yeah, Herb writes me. So
okay. Right. So you suggest, you kind of in your Substack kind of suggested that, this guy is who elders are, but he isn't.
You don't think so?
No, this guy is profiling. This guy does not come accidentally to Synod in overalls. He comes to Synod to present a profile of a certain kind of, hayseed intellectual or whatever, hayseed, so that, he gets all kinds of respect there, and he comes to every Synod. So he's been to Synods for years. And he is concerned with the clicks. He's getting the clicks, actually.
You are right about that. Yeah, he is definitely, you're right. There's a purpose to it. But I do still think that, when I think of most elders, for example, and especially a lot of these rural communities, like the one I grew up in, and I keep using Linden as an example because that's the experience I have and you have as well. But I still have to think that, there are churches whose church calendars revolve around planting seasons. I know there are in Iowa, at least. And service times revolve around the milking of cows, and that is changing. That is definitely changing. And you're right. There are certain people in the denomination who are playing a role, so to speak. But I think the mistake that a lot of those in Grand Rapids have made is that they think that is dropped to zero, and that is just a relic of the past, when it's very much not past, I don't think.
No, it's not past at all, because it's new. That's what.
See, and well, let's talk about your thesis, Clay, because I agree with a lot of it, and I agree with a lot of it because a lot of this I have laid out in my videos. But a piece that for example, probably one of the most important books in the Christian Reformed Church in the last while has been this one, and Kristen is probably the highest profile in certain communities, the highest profile member of the Christian Reformed Church, the highest profile professor at Calvin University. This, by a long ways, I would imagine, is the best-selling book by a Calvin University professor, could be ever.
Ever. There's never been a Calvin University professor before Kristen on the New York Times bestseller list.
Right. So major monumental work. And my problem with this work is not that she can recognize Americanism and evangelicalism and their intertwined stories. That, you can, to see that, you can go all the way back to Amy Semper McPherson.
Yeah. Okay.
A name that, well, not Christian Reformed, obviously, but similar dynamics in the culture and in the country. The problem, I think there's two ways I would very much engage your thesis. Your thesis is that the church my grandparents grew up in. So my grandparents grew up at the beginning of the 20th century at Hall in Kalamazoo. My grandmother worked in a farm on Lafayette, which, if you know where Madison Square is, Lafayette is just a few streets behind.
Mhm.
She was working in celery fields, and she'd tell me how they would have planks so that the celery wouldn't get green because nobody wanted to eat green celery. And she told me about a story where she, as a young girl, went to church, and there was the technology to have stockings that could be sort of colored similar to flesh. And so she comes to church one Sunday morning to Oakdale Park, and she's wearing flesh-colored stockings, and an elder in the church looks at her, probably in Dutch at this point, because this is before the First World War, and says, "Young lady, it is a terrible thing for you to come to church without stockings." And my grandmother, who was very deeply conservative woman, very much against women in office, my grandmother piped up to him and said, "These are flesh-colored stockings." I mean, she remembered that to, she remembered that and told me that story.
Yeah.
Now, the Calvin circulatory system, the feeder system, what I had noticed in the last 10, 15 years here is not that Calvin grads no longer move to Sacramento. They do.
But they don't look up Christian Reformed churches.
They don't go to any church.
So that could be too. Yeah.
No, that not that could be.
That is okay.
That is.
All right. All right. Sure.
And so you can tell the story in terms of the rise of evangelicalism, but my real beef with this book isn't that white evangelicals have issues in terms of how they get their religion and their politics mixed up. That's to me, that's a very uninteresting thesis. I think the bigger thesis is that what happened to the main line in American history, because the natural process for the Christian Reformed Church, very much in keeping with the Scandinavians, the Scandinavian evangelicals, the Lutherans. I mean, when the Christian Reformed Church 10, 15 years ago wanted to map out their big plan, they looked at the Covenant Church that had been successful in planting megachurches here in Sacramento. This is an area in which the Covenant Church has been enormously successful. Multiple megachurches in the distant suburb of wealthy whites, megachurch in my area, Bayside of South Sacramento, African-American leadership. I mean, they managed to do what home missions really wanted to do in the 80s and 90s. The Covenant Church managed to do it. Okay. And they managed to do it by basically taking the big box, non-denominational evangelical church and applying it in a way that most Christian Reformed pastors, by virtue of our formation, we just really couldn't do it. We couldn't sort of go full whole hog in that way, because the Christian Reformed Church has been in a process of assimilation. And the two dominant groups, all the way back to the modernist fundamentalist days, have been the main line and the fundamentalists sort of morph into the evangelicals, at least part of them. and the main line, which had been in many ways the state church of the United States. You see that reflected in FDR. You know, Eleanor Roosevelt was this towering figure, especially, you know, in the formation of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. And while on one hand, you can see the assimilation of Christian Reformed people into the evangelical world, you will spot the Left Behind series popping up in places like, I think my mother deep sixed it out of the library at Pleasant Street Christian Reformed Church in Whitensville, Massachusetts. I think she saw it there and it conveniently got checked out and never returned. But my mother, of course, born and bred in Whitensville, you know, nobody's gonna come after my mother because she's Henry Osterman's daughter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the real question here is, in many ways, there were two tracks in the Christian Reformed Church, the main line and the evangelical, and that assimilation process has continued. The prophilicity, I'm gonna share my screen. Well, let's see. Here, I'm gonna share this screen. Do you want to see prophilicity? Here's prophilicity. This is prophilicity of activism. And we've seen, you know, we saw in George Floyd during the pandemic, we saw George Floyd, people on their knees, people praying, people repenting. People were looking at and saying, wow, looks like another great awakening. I mean, outside of synod, these are, let's take from another rather high profile Calvin Seminary professor, James K.A. Smith. These are the liturgies of the civil rights movement adopted by all of the other liberationist movements hence. And these are within the Christian Reformed Church too. So on one hand, I will agree with you that these liturgies have been taken up by now the new conservatives in the Christian Reformed Church, but they are equally taken up by the other side in the Christian Reformed Church. I don't see a story in which the Christian Reformed Church establishment, rather moderate liberal establishment, sort of looking to the main line as this is the template that we want to follow. I don't see them being any less in terms of profiles as the other. The difference is that the move towards Americanization, the desire of River Terrace, the desire of home missions in the 80s, 90s, planting Granite Springs in Sacramento, the desire of, you know, sending a bunch of us to Willow Creek, but generation before sending, you know, my father to visit Robert Schuller in Southern California. I'm not going to disagree with the Americanization thesis, but you have to apply that across the board. And the key difference is the failure and collapse of the main line. And I would say the main line has sort of been completely subsumed in the bigger issues. But so when alternate paths to ministry is opened up, almost every change in sort of the old school sincerity program that has been put into place that has led to sort of the rapid rise of the young, restless, and reformed presence in the Christian Reformed Church. Almost all of those doors were opened by fundamentally mainline postured programs. We need alternate paths to ministry so people can go to Fuller and Princeton. Oh, but you know where else they're going to go? A lot of other places. We need ethnic diversity. Right now, let's say the left in the Christian, I don't like using these terms, but let's say the affirming wing of the Christian Reformed Church is the oldest, whitest, boomerist area of the church. And when I talk to African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, including Koreans, they are all deeply conservative. And this was exactly what split up the RCA. So when we had the Kingdom Enterprise Zone project, I got to know quite well RCA ministers here on the West Coast. Many of the RCA churches on the West Coast were young, restless, and reformed. Many of those church plants were complementarian when they were being planted. And I remember just before sort of the breakup of the RCA, which, by the way, Dan Ackerman, classmate of mine, former staffer at Home Missions, Tim Vink, very much a dunamis, reformed, pastored the Tulare Community Church further south in the valley here, very much a Signs and Wonders church. These two led the Alliance of Reformed Churches out of the RCA. And the big showdown in the RCA happened because the RCA church closest to me, a Chinese congregation, the pastor there told me the Asian, the Hispanic, and the African-American leadership in the RCA, because the RCA had been pushing, trying to survive by church planting all over America, and the RCA had always been much more open to using these off-the-shelf methods from both groups. They basically came to the RCA leadership with an ultimatum and said, unless and until you do something about these liberal East Coast classes and churches, we're out of here. Eddie Aliman, who I knew because he was in Central California, trained by Neil Hageman, who was the most conservative missionary in the Dominican Republic when I went there, started mints in Southern Florida to train often Hispanic leadership. He becomes the general secretary of the RCA. I mean, what's amazing in this story is that if you don't look at the main line and you don't realize that almost all of the pathways by which the groups that are now in ascendance in the Christian Reformed Church, those doors were opened by the Christian Reformed establishment in pursuit of the post-war baby boomer liberationist authenticity culture. And so the dramatic aspect of this story is that in some ways, it was the CRC establishment that set the table with the knives that are now being pointed at them. And even over the last few years, what has amazed me has been how blind so many in the Christian Reformed Church who have had power for 30 years are to what they're doing. When they set the code of conduct, and again, it tended to be the establishment CRC that really wanted this code of conduct. And all of this was part of the culture of safetyism. They have built the guillotine that so many of them, their heads will roll from. Because, and don't think that the conservatives haven't seen that on the Hesed Project website. They called out Jeff Wyma and dangled the code of conduct.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, you know how much tinkering a synod would need to do to that code of conduct to make it the absolute perfect purge tool to purify the denomination? I mean, I've been watching this happen. And, to me, and then Ken, he's put the numbers there. I mean, what I've seen, this has been happening to anybody who's watched closely in the church. You could see it I remember I was at Synod when, there were all of these complaints about the Office of Social Justice. The advisory committee comes back to the main floor with a recommendation of no substantive change, but basically we're going to slap the hands of OSJ, say more about abortion, less about some of these other issues, and basically nothing will happen. The advisory committee fails. And when I saw that at Synod, it might have been 2008, I thought things have changed from 1998. And then I'm at another Synod with a very tearful Bob Damore, mea culpa, apologizing to the denomination for what he put in the banner.
Yeah.
Fast forward to 2016, and I thought the Christian Reformed establishment that has been primarily with this one track going on, this is when again, the advisory committee comes back and says, we're going to establish an HSR committee, and we are going to make sure that, because we're so dissatisfied with the 2016 report on pastoral care to homosexuals, we're going to make sure that everybody on this committee is within this framework. I thought, if you folks aren't paying attention, and then you go to 2018 and the all one body meeting in Grand Rapids, which Dan Winowski, a conservative, goes to, a conservative not with a Christian Reformed last name, with a Polish last name, goes to this meeting, and all one body basically publicly says what everybody knew, you know, we're never going to get this through Synod. So what we're going to do is there's going to be a test case at some point. And yes, there will be. There's going to be a test case at some point, and basically the Christian Reformed Church won't have the guts to discipline. And I thought,
things have changed.
Big change. And then 2022
Not
comes
the same
around,
world.
and I knew the HSR would pass. I was less certain about the question of confessionality using that machinery. And then, of course, when the votes came in, it was, wow. And then I thought, okay, we know how Synod is structured. And from watching what I've watched in the denomination for the last 30 years, this was not surprising to me. And I'd been telling people, this is coming. We want to, 2012, we want to start talking about confessions and what they mean. And we want to start asking far deeper questions about how we read Scripture. Are we all still on the same page? And so then 2022 comes, and then I'm talking to people that have been in my tribe, because I come from the racial reconciliation tribe. I'm talking to people in my tribe, and I'm saying, you know, the house is on fire, people. Your, you know, heads are going to roll. And I hear back, no, these are activists, and they just managed to get enough people going to Synod. And so for Synod 2023, we're going to have a big push to get the right people to Synod. And I'm thinking, y'all are fooling yourselves. And so Synod 2023 comes, and same story. And I'm still waiting for this group of people to wake up. And then in Synod 2022, they really push hard the code of conduct. They don't get it. They get it in Synod 2023 against a lot of conservative opposition. But the moderates, that seemed reasonable. We want to keep kids safe. You know, bad actors arise. You need the tools to deal with them. And I'm thinking, this group of people that have been in power in the denomination for a long time, and for the most part have had most of their agenda go through, they have set the table with the knives that are going to be used against them, and they still don't know it.
There's a counterfactual history, you know, which I've written a little bit about, where, you know, around 2007, 2008, 2009, when there were conversations about the form of subscription and women delegates and the Bellhart, all those things kind of happening in that window. In a previous era, again, before the internet, in a previous era, you could have predicted some sort of institutional right-wing split. Maybe not big, but enough to kind of put the brakes on it a little bit. That would have removed, you know, it's hard to talk in these crude terms, but that would have removed a few of the extreme right voices on the 5% of the right of the denomination. And fast forward again to 2016 and 2021 and 2022 with the HSR, that really would have potentially happened again, right? Where there's this big issue, the establishment is strong, the right can't organize effectively enough to change the conversation within the denomination, but they can organize, you know, effectively enough to remove themselves from the denomination. You know, so there's all these periods, I feel like once a decade since World War II, where a thing happens and the 5% on the right, on the far right, leave, and the denomination keeps kind of this establishment driven, moderate to left drift a little bit. I mean, I've argued that somewhere around 2007, 8, 9, 10, 11, that the ability of the right to organize stopped that. And that's what, to me, is really undermined kind of the default institutional trajectory. And it's that fact that the establishment hasn't caught on to still yet in 2024.
And all you're saying, Kent, is exactly what I just said earlier, which is that it was about that point where you suddenly you weren't talking about authenticity culture anymore. You were talking about prophylicity, and the right grabbed it much more firmly. You know, I mean, you can show me the picture of the protest outside the Fine Arts Building when the HSR was being, but that was, you know, there were not a lot of people. They were all old. You know, it was a I don't know what the CRC establishment is anymore. I don't know. You know, we've been talking about establishment people in. But I don't know that we actually have a CRC establishment anymore. Who are they? I mean, who are we talking about? Calvin professors? Calvin seminary professors? Yeah, there they are.
Do you know who the big guy is with the sleeveless top and the gray hair leading the charge? You know his name?
No, I actually don't.
I do. I know his name. He was a year ahead of me at Calvin. You know, very much big man on campus. He went to seminary with me. His name is Keith Manis.
Oh,
do a little Googling with Keith Manis.
I know Keith.
Yeah.
But I couldn't see from there. But anyway, yeah. But who are but Keith Manis is not even in the denomination anymore, right?
No, he isn't.
Yeah. So
which is key. This is, I mean, it's these things that tell. Keep going, Clay. I'm sorry. I should have interrupted.
So what establishment in you know, the seminary professors, Calvin Seminary hasn't exercised theological leadership for years, except now a little bit with somebody like Jeff Wyma, you know, leading it right. Okay. But you don't, I mean, that kind of gentle leftist leaning people, who are they? And the Calvin philosophy department no longer has that. You raise Christian
James K. Smith.
James K. Smith, but
we're beyond the days of Mao and Plantinga and Walter Storff and
or take the denominational office. You know, Zach King is now the head guy, but that thing went through a whole lot of changes and shifts, and there's very little power out of this central apparatus you know, they don't have the money anymore, for one thing. It's the money is they changed the money system with predictable results, and so what's happened is that denomination is going differently. It's going differently in a profound way. And maybe that moment in 2016 when, or even earlier in, what'd you say, 2008, Paul, when suddenly you started to have this kind of little bit more organized thing. Maybe that's when it shifted. I don't know. But we're not in the same denomination anymore.
Well, and I think organized is one issue, but demographics is the other. And again, part of what I hear from groups that are sort of, you know, Hesed, Reformed Journal, I mean, it's still around, obviously in a much different phase. It is not what it was, you know, in the 60s and 70s and 80s. But you know, again, I hear people dismissing, oh, this is a factor of organization. No, it is a factor of organization, but it is, you don't get swings in the votes like this without the reflecting of the demographic. I also just recently had a video pointed out, or I made a video pointing out that if you go back over agendas for synod and you look at roles of people going to church, for the vast majority, you never had empty slots in classical delegations. And this is for 2-week synods where people had to travel. I mean, it's interesting. I've been going through Acts of Synod, and all synods had this little note about basically if you're going to drive, make sure you carpool. And please
Yeah.
fly. I mean, this is all stuff that Clay, you will very much remember.
Oh yeah, of course.
And, but you never, I mean, to be able to go to synod this was a high point. I don't know if my mother's father, Henry Osterman, I don't know if he ever went to synod as a delegate. He had been an elder in the church, but to actually, to get to be an elder of the church, now you've got status. And then to go to classis, now you've got even more status. And then to be able to be allowed to go to synod. I mean, for someone of my grandparents' generation, that really meant something. You were a person of status and consequence in your community. We've got 1 week, we've got free airfare, and Classis Hudson is sending 2 delegates to synod this year. Classis Hudson, when I was growing up, so one of the things in the 90s, I came back to New Jersey when I was doing my field work as a missionary in the Dominican Republic, and I looked around and thought, this Christian reformdom in northern New Jersey is a shriveling old person compared to what it was when I was growing up. And this gets back to, because Clay, you're right, you're sitting in Walnut Creek. There's no better example than Walnut Creek of this entire story. And so on one hand, it's easy to sort of say, well, it's a failure of your leadership, obviously, but you can't ignore, and I know, Clay, you tend to be prone to talk theologically. The theology of the left has simply not borne fruit in institutional Christianity. It's and culturally,
now, Paul, you're absolutely right. If you're going to tell the story, you have to do the de-churching of America story,
yes,
as the framework over the whole thing. So in part, what happened in CRC churches is that the whole mission board wanted to expand, 400,000 by the year 2000, right? I mean, what's happened to that? So the whole mission board, for all the time, they kept grabbing whatever was the latest and greatest. So you mentioned Bob Schuller. They're sending people to Bob Schuller. Before that, it was James Kennedy. James Kennedy, Coral Ridge Presbyterian, evangelism explosion. And this is where, again, it fits into that, where you move from the sincerity culture into the authenticity culture. I remember people that I very much loved and respected talking to me about how, you got to ask those 2 questions, one of which is, if you went to heaven today,
if you were to die tonight, what would you say to Jesus to let you into his heaven?
That's right. Well, man, that is so
there's a frame around that.
Right. So part of the frame around this is the fact that CRC churches weren't doing all that well. And so how do we build the denomination back up numerically? I mean, you can look at it in business terms. It was pretty cynical, but nobody meant it in cynical ways. They were all convinced of this. It was not. There were no bad actors in all this. It's just that what happens in CRCs. Let me just do a little aside here. What happens in CRCs is that people like Walnut Creek, for example, is that people who are so the CRC styles evangelical, and that really got reinforced when evangelical churches moved into Pentecostal worship, of which Kent was. There's a part of Kent's story that we have not talked about, which is Kent as the worship leader. And Kent being there at
well, he does go to Madison Square.
At the
that
Calvin,
says something.
Well, and Kent is a pianist. He is he's a primo worship pianist.
Wish he'd moved to Sacramento.
Right. Well, I mean, I employed him for a while.
That's right, at River Terrace for a little bit.
Yeah. But so CRC styles evangelical. You go to synods, and there's a beautiful big organ up in front in the Fine Arts Building, and it rarely gets played at a synod. You know, maybe once or twice during the synod, they bring out somebody to play the organ. What you have is a band, right? So it does worship the way evangelical churches do worship. It doesn't do it the way mainline churches do worship. It does it with a band and with whatever's on the latest, whatever the Christian radio station is in the area. They sing those songs, and that's. But when people get there for a while, evangelicals come. They get there for a while. They start to notice that there's something a little off about the way CRCs do church. They're not really evangelical. And so at that point, they often just walk back out the door because they say, this church is not what it says, what it advertises. That I see as a total failure of leadership on the part of the denomination, that the denomination kept putting people into, okay, this church is doing well, Willow Creek's doing well, let's go there. Saddleback's doing well, let's go there. And none of that was actually CRC in any real sense. Maybe the covenant people figured out how to do that in a way that they could retain covenantalism or whatever. And
they're big box evangelicals.
Yeah, they're big box, right. So then let's go back to that thing about the mainline churches. So what's happened to mainline churches?
One question, and maybe you can come back to this. I don't know if this is the right time to ask it, but to me, though, there is a sense of resurgence in returning to kind of those original, those ways of worship and being church that were characteristic of what, say, Third CRC was in the 70s and 80s. I'm thinking specifically, I listened to the podcast, The Messy Reformation. I don't know if the two of you have listened to that, but, Jason, I think his last name is Rice. I don't know how to pronounce it, but, he's interviewing pastors all over the Midwest. And it's such an important glimpse into the transformation that's going on in these churches. And it is a transformation, and he's interviewing pastors who are smoking meat all day Saturday, sitting on the patio, reading Bavinck, and the organ is played Sunday morning. And I do think there is a subset of churches that not only didn't go that direction, but is actively going the opposite direction now. And it's being led by guys in their 30s who are, reading Piper and reading Bavinck and reading Kuyper.
Yep.
Anyway, I didn't want to stop and bypass that, but continue.
No, yeah. That is absolutely perfect. That's exactly where I was going. So the fact is that mainline churches have gone down, right? I mean, they've lost, and they're continuing, I think, still.
Yeah, they're in a free fall.
I don't know that they're in a free fall, though. That's what I think. So I go to Episcopal churches a lot when I'm not preaching, and I go to Episcopal churches that look to me like they're growing, and that there is a kind of enthusiasm there, a sense of identity in those churches. And overall, maybe the Episcopal Church is still going down, but I don't think it's a free fall. I think that there's been a kind of settling over the last while of churches and people trying to figure out, okay, now, how do we do church in a post-evangelical time? And in some ways, the evangelicals have helped out because they've gone whole into right-wing politics, and there are a lot of people that just can't abide the church going wholesale into. I mean, maybe this is a mistake that the left made in previous generation. They kind of went whole hog into a certain kind of liberal politics, and that turned people off, and they walked. They said, no, the church should be about other things than that. And now I think maybe some of that's happening in the other direction. But what the CRC has failed to do is to articulate a reason for anybody to be CRC that is intrinsic to the actual tradition of which we're a part. And taking into that tradition Bavinck and Berkhoff and Kuyper and Calvin and so forth, but being able to, and the confessions, and be able to understand those confessions in terms of a historical flow, rather than weaponizing them to go after Christian Demey or something.